This is Chris Hedges, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And our industrious producer, Hannah Feldman.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader.
Hello, everybody. It's about the rising opposition from many quarters to the tyrant Trump and his musketeers.
That's right, Ralph. On the program today, we welcome back friend of the show, co-president of Public Citizen, Robert Weissman. Public Citizen has 8 lawsuits in the works against the illegal dismantling of the United States government being conducted by the Trump administration and the DOGE bros. Rob is going to update us on those actions, specifically what's going on with the IRS, the EPA, and one of the most truly efficient government agencies of all time, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Then resident constitutional scholar Bruce Fein joins us to talk about the Public Interest Law Day held at Harvard Law School this past week, and the importance of training lawyers to be more than just corporate shills. Plus, he'll fill us in on what's going on with the Trump administration's assault on the district courts that have been blocking some of his worst initiatives. Then we're going to take a long overdue dive into the mailbag and have Ralph answer a few listener questions. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's hear how Public Citizen is leading the resistance. David?
Robert Weissman is a staunch public interest advocate and activist, as well as an expert on a wide variety of issues, ranging from corporate accountability and government transparency to trade and globalization to economic and regulatory policy. As the president of Public Citizen, he has spearheaded the effort to loosen the chokehold corporations and the wealthy have over our democracy. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Robert Weissman.
Great to be with you.
Yeah, welcome back, Robert. You know, every day the papers are full of Trump's violations of federal laws, federal regulation, constitutional provisions. He's the most impeachable president in American history. He makes no bones about it. He said with Article 2 in the Constitution, he can do whatever he wants as president, and he's proved it. And he talks about being a dictator, half jokingly, before he was elected to be a dictator by a plurality of voters. He's talked about being a king. So he's not like Nixon slinking back into a corner. He's right up there, basically declaring war on the American people, overthrowing the U.S. government, destroying or dismantling the federal civil service, and taking one agency at a time that protects the health, safety, and economic well-being of the American people, either wanting to shut it down, like the Department of Education or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is partially reopened, or to get rid of the enforcement agencies or weaken them to the point where they can't perform their job. And that would include the Justice Department, the Antitrust Division, as well as the Federal Trade Commission. He's fired the 2 Democratic Federal Trade Commissioners confirmed by Congress. And he's methodically going after the countervailing restraints in our republic. He's going after the media. He's going after labor unions. He's going after citizen groups, going after universities. He has neutralized Congress with the slim majority of the Republicans controlling the House and the Senate. And he's been handed some presents to do what he's doing by the Supreme Court, including the notorious decision known accurately as Trump versus the United States last June, when the Supreme Court 6-3 said that in his official capacity, he could not be criminally prosecuted without defining official capacity. So with that background, Robert Weissman, tell me what the civic groups led by Public Citizen are doing, both in terms of a litigation strategy and an overall strategy, because you do have Congress Watch and you do have supporters around the country who are active and showing up at town meetings.
Well, thanks, Ralph. It's exactly as you say. I think the nation is facing an authoritarian onslaught that really has no precedent in our history. I think it's really important for everyone to wrap their heads around it. It's a hard truth to face, but we have to face it. I think for people in Washington, D.C., it's been very visceral because so many people have been fired or fearing that they may be fired. It's very personal. There's fear in the air, and people are well aware of it. I think outside of DC, if you're a politically engaged person, you're aware of it. But if you're not, it may feel like a little bit like it's just more theater in Washington, and it's not. And we have to make sure that everyone understands that. So we're doing everything from litigating to trying to mobilize the public. We filed quite a number of lawsuits against the illegality and unconstitutional actions of the administration. And we've got 8 filed so far. We're going to be up to, I think, over a dozen by end of next week, with a lot more to come after that in a variety of areas, from everything from illegally shutting down government agencies to illegally accessing private information of people through Elon Musk's DOGE operation, towards suppressing and censoring information that should be available to the public. And we think that the efforts in the courts are really vital to stem the illegal and unconstitutional actions of the administration, but also to show that there's a way to fight back. In these early days and months of the administration, there's been a sense that Trump is inevitable and unstoppable. And the actions in the courts, I think, have been really critical to illustrating that that's not true. Ultimately, we're going to defeat Trump by putting people on the streets in big enough numbers to counteract his power and also instill some spine in the congressional opposition, and maybe even break off some of the Republicans who may choose not to go down with the Trump ship. I think we've been a little slow to get that moving, but there's big actions planned around the country for today on April 5th. And those are going to be, I think, a really big scale and going to start to really supercharge the opposition. Combined with the defeat of the Elon Musk effort and the Supreme Court campaign in Wisconsin, I think it's going to reset the national narrative about who has political power and political momentum. And we're going to have an opportunity to really push back in a much bigger way on this authoritarian nightmare.
Let's parse this, what you're commenting on. The Musketeers' poisonous tusks of Elon Musk, which is what he should be called, has targeted the IRS. They want to cut 45,000 jobs. That is 1 out of every 2 IRS staff, which will severely reduce the amount of revenue collected and aid in a massive high-level tax evasion by the super rich and the corporation. What is being done to stop him there? Because, as you know, these firings of the federal civil service without cause have been already decided by some courts, I think, Robert, to be unlawful. So what's the strategy on the IRS?
Yeah, well, I think it's important to underscore what you just said, Ralph. So they're trying to fire people from the IRS. One of the things that happened under the Biden administration was finally infusing some money into the IRS. And people should understand that is a really pro-public, pro-equality measure. Because what all this new staff at the IRS are designed to do, exactly as you said, is to crack down on tax fraud by the rich and corporations. And the moves that Musk and Trump are making at the IRS are projected to cost $300 billion in revenue, $300 billion, because people and corporations will be able to cheat better. So that's what's
a year.
I think that's over multiple years, but gigantic amounts. And it's true throughout all of what Musk is doing, but maybe nowhere more clear here. The idea that they're going after waste and fraud, they are enabling waste and fraud, as well as committing waste and fraud through their own actions. So the efforts, there's a couple different efforts at this agency and others. Part of it is dealing with the employees themselves. So there have been some significant early successes in bringing cases, first on behalf of the probationary employees. So they tried to basically fire everyone in the government who's a probationary employee because their employment protections are lesser than longer-term employees. However, although they don't have the stronger rights of longer-term employees, they are supposed to be given individualized consideration. So there have been cases now moving forward where judges are saying, well, you can't just fire everybody with a form letter that says you've been found to be unsatisfactory when it's obvious that there was no individualized review. So these cases are going to take a while to filter out. There's more than one of them, but they're going positively so far. The other thing that's going on is for the longer-term employees, in some cases, they've tried to close the whole agency, just try to get rid of everybody. In other cases, they've had a little bit more respect, a modest amount more respect for the proper process, which is called, in the government's terms, reduction in force, RIF. So they talk about riffing people. They're trying to do that at a major scale, but again, without really following the proper process. So there's lawsuits going on about those One challenge with those cases is inside the government, employment cases are supposed to be channeled, it's called, to an administrative process, not handled in regular courts. That administrative process is not equipped to deal with a huge number of cases we've got going forward. So it's going to take some time to sort this out or to see if the cases can bump to real courts because the administrative process is unable to deal with them on a timely basis. So that's a long answer to saying it's going to take some time to sort this out. There's some ways the IRS is like other agencies, and there's some things that are probably not as good in the IRS case as it is where they're trying to shut down agencies or plainly violating statutory directives from Congress.
Well, apart from the people who are dying in Africa and elsewhere with the cutoff of humanitarian aid by the Agency for International Development, which he has closed down physically, and a lot of the funding for AIDS medicines, for tuberculosis, for malaria, which are saving lives every day in these countries, have now cut off. One of the most dangerous forays of Trump and Musk is what they're doing to the Environmental Protection Agency and its mission to reduce carcinogenic products, pollution of air, water, soil, food, handle with climate violence and other environmental disasters. Can you describe what's happening there in particular? Because there's so many strong environmental groups with a lot of lawyers like NRDC and Environmental Defense. Describe what's happening to EPA, especially since Trump promised pure air and pure water constantly on the election path before November.
Yeah, it's more like pure pollution or pure profits for the polluters. There are a lot of things going on at the Environmental Protection Agency, all bad. They parallel what's going on at other regulatory agencies. One is reducing staff or closing parts of the agency that do important functions. Not surprisingly, they're closing down the environmental justice portions of the agency. Those were really significantly expanded under Biden and did a lot of important work that wasn't appreciated, including by making general standards stronger to take care of particular environmental justice considerations. So, for example, the Biden administration strengthened rules on lead and pipes and was moving to get lead pipes removed faster because of the environmental justice considerations. The whole part of the organization that dealt with that is gone. They're also both going to roll back a vast array of new standards that have been issued in the recent years against polluters. So that exactly the opposite. Those standards that would have made our air cleaner and our water safer, those are being pulled back. They stopped all enforcement of existing actions, or at least criminal enforcement against polluters. And they've made clear that there really isn't going to be much, if any, enforcement going forward. So it's open season for the polluters. And of course, they're also promoting in a variety of ways a rush towards climate catastrophe by undoing the positive measures that have come recently from the Biden administration to deal with the climate crisis and trying to promote further fossil fuel production and use, including even coal, which is completely uneconomic at this point. So I think we're seeing both. We're going to see chronic illness and chronic problems significantly rise. And it's between this agency and others, it's a near certainty that we're going to see significant industrial disasters. If you pull back all the enforcement rules and you say we're not going to enforce the rules that are left over, corporations get the message and they're going to be more reckless. And it's a near certainty that we're going to have many more serious industrial disasters as a direct result of what they're doing at EPA and other agencies.
Many of these industrial disasters may well come from the chemical plants that are near cities all over the country, well documented. The conclusion here is that more people are going to get cancer, respiratory ailments, and more people are going to die. His message, basically, based on what he's doing, not what he's bloviating, is let them die. Another area, he's cutting back on CDC funds dealing with studying and anticipating pandemics and other epidemic diseases. He's cutting down on the National Institutes of Health research in this area and indirectly affecting state health departments. There's an article recently on how they are severely being weakened as a result because of the federal government's role in funding these departments. So what we're seeing here is a cataclysmic. There's no better word to describe it. Let's talk about the Democratic Party opposition here. A few days ago, we had a small informative demonstration in front of the Democratic National Committee headquarters, not far from the Congress, passing out materials about how Democrats can defeat the Republicans with kitchen table issues, increase the minimum wage, crack down on corporate crooks who are stealing people's hard-earned money and savings, make it easier to form labor unions, increase taxes on the super rich and the rich. That comes in at 85%, by the way. And 65 million seniors would benefit from a raise in the benefits of Social Security, which have been frozen for 45 years. A couple of hundred Democrats voted for that a couple of years ago in the House of Representatives, but it never went to the floor. And our allies were standing there, Robert, and they realized it was like a mausoleum. There wasn't anybody there to receive the materials or to say, come on in, you stand for what we stand for, and let's talk a bit around the table. Finally, somebody poked its head out the door and said, you mail that stuff. We don't accept that stuff. In the meantime, at the side door, Democrats were leaving their offices in Congress to go into the bullpen where they had cubicles, where they had a staffer with a list of names dialing for dollars. So the problem with Trump is not just Trump, it's with a weak Democratic Party. So let me ask you a number of questions here. We have urged the Democratic Party to have informal hearings on Capitol Hill. You know, they're the minority, but there's nothing stopping them. Elizabeth Warren had an informal hearing on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau a few weeks ago. She had a committee room. The media was there. She got reports. Now, Congress Watch is pressing for informal hearings at all these committees. That way, the Democratic Party can indicate what it stands for. It could counter the Republican majority. It could inform the public. It could invigorate and lift the morale of citizen groups, on and on. Tell us what Congress Watch is doing.
Well, in general, it's pushing for the Democrats and any Republicans who want to go along to oppose Trump's authoritarianism and his pro-billionaire corporate class agenda. There actually have been quite a few of these shadow hearings going on. There was a couple this week on Social Security and other issues where they've done a decent job of bringing up people who are directly affected to tell their stories, and they get the media attention they do. I think there's sort of two pieces for the big work to move the Democrats to be more forceful opponents. The first is to stop being timid and to just be ready to be aggressive in challenging Trump. You know, after the election, there's a certain normalcy to this, but there was a lot of uncertainty, not just the finger pointing, but also kind of a loss of sense of clarity and, you know, I think an overinterpretation of a bad election result. And we really had not seen aggressive pushback from congressional leadership. I think that's beginning to change. And I think there's a pretty clear theory of how to make a change. It's not, the Democratic leaders are who they are, but they will be more aggressive if people are pushing them to be more aggressive. So if we have hundreds of thousands of people out on the street, that will make them more aggressive. I think that's beginning to happen, and I think that's going to happen. They're looking forward to the big fight over what's called budget reconciliation, the big tax and budget bill that's going to be the only significant legislating for the year, in which Trump and the Republicans are trying to cut taxes on the rich and billionaires, paid for in part by cutting Medicaid, food stamps, SNAP, and other key programs. And they're lined up to be tough on that. And I think that as momentum builds from the public, as they see there's really demand at these town hall meetings, at big demonstrations, as Cory Booker filibusters and gets massive support, I think momentum is going to grow for them to be reasonably tough in opposition, as in fact they were in the first Trump administration. The other piece, though, is not just to be an opposition, but to actually be for something and just take up the agenda points that you were talking about. And that's going to require more from us. So it should be easy for them, and it actually is easy for them to say no to tax cuts for billionaires. But are they ready to say yes to making billionaires pay more? Easy to say don't cut Medicaid. Are they ready to say expand Medicare, Medicare for all, or even the more easier incremental steps of expanding and improving Medicare by lowering the eligibility age and making sure we have coverage of dental, hearing, vision, home health care, and so on? Are they going to take up and be serious, as you say, about raising the minimum wage? Are they going to say, not just we oppose Trump's attacks on labor unions, which are of historic importance. But we actually think it's vital that we change labor law to make it possible for workers to organize again. And we support legislation, not just pretend to support it, but plan to deliver on that legislation. Are they going to do those things? Well, they're not ready to do that yet. And that's going to take a lot more pushing from our side.
Well, they don't seem to be ready to do what they did a few years ago, to extend the child's tax credit, which provided about $300 a month for 61 million children in this country, and cut child poverty by almost 40%. That ought to be an easy one. That comes in huge support from left-right voters, not to mention the European and Canadian social nets for maternal care, child care, family care, all the things that other Western countries have had for many years. I mean, it's wide open for the Democratic Party to landslide the Republicans. Well, the most optimistic playbook here is that with Trump going crazy against the livelihoods and dire necessities of the American people, that the polls drop for him, the economy starts tanking, prices start going up higher and higher, and the market collapses with loss of pension money and savings for tens of millions of Americans, and the demonstrations increase with one message: you're fired. That's a phrase he understands, isn't it? You're fired, tyrant Trump, dangerous Donald. You're fired, fascistic Trump, ringing through the land. Now that will bolster the Congress, forces in the Congress. When the Republican Party realizes that with the upcoming 2026 election, it's their political skin or Trump's, they're going to do what the Republicans did for far less provocation under the Nixon administration when they sent a delegation of senators to Nixon and said, your time is up, and he resigned. So right now people say, impossible, this will never happen. Well, that's what they said about Nixon, but what Trump and Musk are doing to the American people is far, far more devastating, right down to their livelihood, their health, safety, economic well-being, freedom of speech, civil rights, civil liberties, you name it. The second playbook is that it results in a serious impeachment drive. The one thing he cannot control and violate is what our founders put in the Constitution exclusively for Congress. They did not want another monarch. They were very, very fierce in their drafting the Constitution to avoid another King George III. And the swelling of pressure from both right and left in Congress, red state and blue state, will lead to a successful impeachment and removal. That's the optimistic playbook. You know, everybody says that's impossible, but once the people rise, and not just filling town meetings, but rallies all over, vigils in Washington and so forth, in front of the White House, he will overreach. He will provoke. He'll send police out. There'll be beatings, and there'll be more resistance against them as people say, hey, we were your voters in this crowd, and look how you're treating us. What's your view of that scenario?
I think it's the only direction we can go. Whether or not it leads to impeachment, I think we should be open-minded about it. We have to do the same set of things. And unfortunately, I think you're right that we're likely to be aided by a chaotic economy. And it's unfortunate because that means people are going to be hurt. When the economy is hurting, poor people get hurt. That's not something to wish for. But I think it's something that we're inevitably headed for. I was struck by something that's a slight divergence. I read recently from some investment analysts who were saying they're not optimistic about the future of the markets, even though they're anticipating tax cuts, even though they're anticipating deregulation that lets corporations impose costs on everybody else and get profits. They're not optimistic because they think the rule of law is so much in doubt that whether you could even count on contracts being enforced properly, or whether we have a stable society, which is the underpinning and foundation of a strong economy, they're not sure they can count on those things anymore. So in those scenarios, I don't really care where the market's going, but I do care about people having jobs and their well-being, and people are likely to feel some pain. But that, coupled with, I think, the anger over the authoritarianism and the cruelty of the Trump agenda, I think is going to generate that mass mobilization. And whether it's through impeachment or through elections, I think that's how we win. But that's not guaranteed. We have to worry seriously about the integrity of elections. And, you've taught me about this, Ralph. other really serious authoritarian measures that this man may be willing to deploy. Like those are real threats that we face in a way that's never been part of our history, at least not since the Civil War. So you can see the path forward for a better outcome, but the risk of a different scenario is real.
Well, you were pointing out, he just issued an executive order trying to override state law under the Constitution in terms of running elections. So he's got his eye on rigging elections. But if he starts losing the support of the business establishment, especially the small business establishment who's finding his contracts severing and repealed in the last few weeks, I think that will be the final push to basically have the country roar back, "You're fired, resign," and feed the impeachment drive. Because the one thing the business establishment can't stand is total chaos and unpredictability. Look at the auto companies now. The chief executives are beside themselves with these tariffs. The head of Ford said, this is going to put a huge hole into our industry. Anyway, for our listeners who may be dejected and depressed, that's the scenario, and of course you can make it happen. Once the people rise, nothing can stop the destination that they're pressing for. So take heart, people. On that point, Steve?
Rob, with all this dismantling of government agencies, it's easy to take a chainsaw to all of this. How hard is it going to be to put Humpty Dumpty back together, assuming that a new administration can defeat this?
We call it Trumpty Dumpty, Steve, not Humpty Dumpty.
Well, I'm not looking to put him back together. I'm looking to put the government back together, which is obviously being illegally dismantled. I mean, it's easy to move fast and break things, but then you've got to rebuild it.
It's going to be tough, and it'll depend in part on how successful we are with some of these lawsuits. So, for example, if we can protect the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau so that it continues to exist, then it's way easier for a new administration to come in, put good people in charge, and get it working again. If it literally no longer exists anymore, there's no building, there's no staff, there's no contracts, the records are destroyed, a lot harder to get that going again. In the case of this really vital humanitarian work by the U.S. Agency for International Development, as we cut off all these contracts and close the agency, notwithstanding the ongoing litigation, organizations are shutting down around the world. And they can't just snap their fingers and come back into being for a new administration. There's going to be an additional problem, which is for government workers, the basic deal has always been, you're not going to get paid a ton of money, but you got a fair amount of job security. You can count on the job being there so long as you do your job. And Trump has broken that promise, and people are going to be suspicious about their prospects of coming back in. That's going to be an additional problem. But there's an opportunity as well, which is as vital as it's going to be to reconstruct and rebuild the broken agencies and institutions of government. Yeah, they did have problems. Depends by agency how effective they were or how ineffective they were, how much they were focusing on advancing the public interest or how much they were too captured by corporate interests. There'll be an opportunity to do things a little bit differently and really build a government that is responsive to public demands and that does not operate at the behest of the industries they're supposed to be regulating. So that'll be a big challenge to plan that out and then to push a new administration to make sure it happens. That's the small little bit of opportunity we have amidst this nightmare.
David?
After Watergate, we gave the president hundreds of emergency powers. And right now, the president is invoking the Alien Enemies Act, declaring that we're at war. If he gets away with shipping these migrants to El Salvador, then it's over, right? If he can get away with invoking the Enemy Aliens Act, then he can invoke any of those hundreds of emergency powers he has. Is that correct?
Well, it's never over. So I refuse to concede that part of it. It's certainly a problem. He's already declared a wide range of emergencies. And this is a very tricky situation where, Congress over many years has given the president emergency powers, basically assuming good faith in an actual emergency. In an actual emergency, you do want to have some flexibility for the president. Now, with a bad faith president who will declare emergencies where they don't exist, we're really in danger. The Alien Enemies Act is one, of course, that's a law that goes back to 1798. But we're seeing, he's declared an energy emergency as well as a way to justify more oil and gas drilling and even possibly subsidies for coal, which is far too expensive as well as being far too polluting. notably in his definition of energy and the executive order declaring an energy emergency, there's a long list of what constitutes energy, and it specifically excludes solar and wind energy. So that itself mocks the whole idea that there's actually anything to do with a legitimate emergency. And we are going to see the courts have to grapple with, does the president have the authority and right to just snap his fingers and say emergency and make it so? Or is there some objective determination of what constitutes an emergency?
And he's smacking his lips about the Insurrection Act. Can you explain that?
Well, there are a variety of statutes that in an emergency context give the president the ability to basically deploy military force, National Guard or otherwise, in the United States. And, that's a phase we're not yet in. Either, in quotes, legitimate deployment of military force or illegitimate, not in quotes, deployment of paramilitary forces to crack down on protests and dissenters. Those are real worries. You could say the antecedents of it are in these efforts around immigration and picking up people in the United States who are here with proper documentation but are being abducted because of their political viewpoints and statements. But there's a lot to worry about here.
He has no reluctance to impose a police state on this country. He's already shown it with the kidnapping of graduate students, for example, masked men, plain clothes, representing ICE, kidnapping a 30-year-old doctorate student at Tufts University the other day and disappearing her into a Louisiana prison. And Trump said afterwards, this is only the beginning. So it's not like he's hiding his treacherous and dictatorial purposes. And that's why so many psychologists back in 2017 signed a letter saying this is a seriously unstable personality. And a lot of people scoffed. I don't think as many are scoffing these days. Anna?
One thing that all of these layoffs in DC, the reduction in force has done is it's created a pool of people who used to have job security. They used to have something to lose. I've been very curious about, is there going to be a new bonus army? Let's call it a RIF army. Are there laid off government workers forming a class for a lawsuit? Obviously, the group contains multitudes. Some people are probably just struggling to stay above water, but is there a mobilization of these laid off government employees, either becoming whistleblowers with info they had or joining in the legal efforts to defy the administration?
There's a lot going on. So we're still in early days. I think most of them are still being paid. So they don't have the economic consequences of this yet, even if they're on administrative leave. And hopefully we can get their jobs back before they're permanently separated. But there's a ton of organizing going on among these workers, especially, within agencies. And as they've seen what's going on, people are really rapidly networking among themselves in different offices to make sure, for example, everybody's got everybody's phone number if they're suddenly fired because their government numbers are not going to work anymore. So we're seeing that, and we're seeing a lot of the employees moving forward in the lawsuits. As I was mentioning, it turns out that as it regards the challenging of closing of an agency, the employees are not the best plaintiffs because they're being forced into an administrative process to deal with employment claims. But they have been involved in a number of them, including a number that we've brought. There's also a number of cases being brought forward challenging the actions about laying off these workers, and those are having some significant success early on. I guess maybe one last thing to say about this is federal workers are, to a considerable extent, but it varies, unionized. And what we've seen in these early months of the Trump administration is really the central importance of organized labor. Folks in Washington, D.C. know that there is a fear that's pervasive in the city and the metro area that has no precedent. I don't think even in the McCarthy period, which is before my time, but I don't think ever. Everybody knows someone who's been fired or who fears they're about, with reason, that they're about to be fired. It might be you, it might be your family member, your neighbor, people in your yoga class, whatever. And so it's really, really pervasive. And people are terrified about if they speak up, will someone come after them? Will they pay a really harsh personal price? We've seen in the case we had about recipients of foreign aid grants, organizations that thought they'd be put out of business are so fearful that they didn't want to move forward with lawsuits. The single exception to this have been the labor unions. They have been dynamic. They have not been fearful. They show the power of people coming together, of collective action and collective power. They've brought these lawsuits as plaintiffs and as lawyers. And it's exactly for that reason that Trump has now issued another executive order trying to decertify about 3/4 of the organized workers in the federal workforce. Again, claiming fake national emergencies, by the way. So there's a lot of activity going on. Yes, Hannah, among these workers who are either laid off or facing firings. A lot of it's heroic. A lot of them are really scared for good reason. And a lot of it's going to play out in the courts. And hopefully we're able to keep these people jobs.
And just to round out the corporate state intensification mission of Trump, let's remember that they're attacking in the name of waste, inefficiency, and corruption people's programs like Medicaid, for example, or feeding programs around the country. But they're leaving alone corporate welfare, which is hundreds of billions of dollars a year in subsidies, handouts, giveaways, and corporate tax expenditures. They're leaving alone corporate criminal ripoffs of programs like Medicare, $60 billion a year just on Medicare, ripping off these programs funded by taxpayers. And the Trumpers and the Muskers, they want to expand the bloated, wasteful military budget. So we know what their game is. They're leaving alone the corporate vested interests in Washington and going after the service programs of the U.S. government for all Americans around the country and abroad. Before we conclude, Rob, tell us how people can access Public Citizen and its various programs.
You can see all the work we're doing at citizen.org, catch up on the lawsuits, see about our research on Elon Musk, figure out how we're responding to everything from chaotic tariffs to sweetheart deals for Musk-related companies, all at citizen.org.
Very important to hold Musk accountable. He'll probably leave in about 2 to 3 months, saying his work is done, but he can't get away with it. He can't be allowed to get away with it. And more people are boycotting Tesla, by the way. I'm surprised by the spontaneous expansion of consumer boycotts against Tesla. Well, thank you very much, Robert Weissman, President of Public Citizen. To be continued as always, Rob.
Great. Thanks so much.
We've been speaking with Robert Weissman. We will link to Public Citizen at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, an update from our resident constitutional scholar. Plus, Ralph will answer some of your questions. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 4, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. A West Virginia law signed this week bans synthetic dyes and preservatives in food, a first-in-the-nation consumer protection led by Republicans in the face of vociferous industry opposition. That's according to a report from The Guardian. West Virginia's law is one of dozens of bills introduced across the country as Republican state lawmakers get on board with one of the most powerful forces to emerge from the 2024 election, the movement to Make America Healthy Again, or MAHA. The result has been an explosive growth in proposed legislation to ban synthetic dyes, preservatives, and chemicals in food, chemicals that consumer advocates have railed against, in some cases, for decades. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. He's back. Bruce Fein is here for an update on Donald Trump's assault on the United States Constitution. David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and an expert on international law. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you for the invitation.
Welcome back. Bruce, you went up for that preeminent day at Harvard Law School, your alma mater, with Rob Weissman. We called it the Vigorous Public Interest Law Day, in contrast to the vigorous corporate everyday law day at Harvard, to develop a better balance of horizons for the law students and invigorate some of the faculty into working harder to equate the law with justice, as you say, has no meaning unless it generates justice. You were there for better part of the day, talked with the students. You saw what it was like in the lecture halls where the presentations were made. We'd like your observations. You've written articles for the Harvard Law Record on morality and Harvard Law School. So give us your take. Were you disappointed Were you surprised? And what do you think should be done about it?
I wasn't disappointed with the speakers. They were all had brought luster to the program, the importance of litigation on behalf of those who don't have power and money to hold the government accountable, the crisis that the country confronts now, being run, as you say, with a dictator who didn't have to burn the Reichstag to get Congress to disappear into an ink blot, and rules by executive decree, even overriding the Constitution. We may expect very soon an executive order saying the 22nd Amendment doesn't exist, and now he'll run for a third or a fourth term. All of those things were, I think, highlighted by the speakers, including Mr. Weissman. What was disappointing was the attendance. The high water mark was basically about 30 or 40 at the beginning before classes began in the afternoon, but it quickly dwindled probably to 10 or something like that. And many of those were outside citizens of Cambridge. They weren't even students. The other thing that was disappointing was not a single instructor was present, even though the fact is that if we don't inform the public and with the law students, as well as others in the lead, we're not going to have rule of law, and Harvard Law School will become an irrelevancy. It will be a museum piece. And I spoke to somebody after one of the sessions, and he said he had recently visited Myanmar, formerly Burma, and visited its capital city and asked, what's the law school look like? Taken to the third floor of a 3-floor apartment building and had about 6 by 8 feet, has nothing there but cobwebs. That's what law schools look like when you have tyrannies, when you have dictatorships, which is where we're headed. So you would feel that Harvard Law School would be awakened, that their life is at peril. So all the students, their Harvard law degrees are going to be worth nothing if they end up being like lawyers in China or Russia, where any of the decrees they get in a court of law are simply rubber stamps of what the executive branch has done. And yet, the interest was very tiny, not completely inaudible, but almost close to inaudible. And I think the country and the law students are going to pay a price. They're being very narrow and myopic with regard to their immediate preoccupation with their trade school, where they're going to work the next day, and very little given to the fact that if we don't have a country anymore, they aren't going to have a legal career.
David?
There are close to 200 lawsuits right now challenging Trump's executive orders. We have district judges issuing temporary restraining orders and or injunctions blocking or slowing down these executive orders. So Speaker Johnson is threatening to defund or eliminate some of these courts. Congressman Darrell Issa just introduced legislation blocking district judges from issuing nationwide injunctions. He wants these injunctions to apply only to localized plaintiffs and then have the rulings find their way up to the Supreme Court in order for them to be nationwide. So what is an injunction? I think a lot of people don't know what an injunction is. Does the Constitution provide for federal district courts, or are the courts a construct of Congress, and how much power does the House and the Senate have to pass legislation?
First of all, the idea of being against these nationwide injunctions by district courts, Johnny come lately. When Biden was there, the conservatives were suing him up and down, and they got nationwide injunctions and clapped and were running victory laps. So this is a totally expedient view. Just because Trump's there, they don't like what they thought was wonderful when Biden was there. But an injunction is simply an order to a government official or a defendant to do something. It can do something affirmative or to not do something. But it's unlike damages, which is an award of money to somebody. An injunction is an order that somebody has to do or refrain from doing a particular thing. And it's directed usually at an official, but it can be a private individual as well. Putting that aside, the only actual court that's recognized in the Constitution is the United States Supreme Court. And even the Supreme Court does not have the number of justices enumerated. That is a matter for Congress. They set the number at 9, most recently in 1869, and it's stayed at that number ever since. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to jump it to 15 so he could pack it with his New Dealers. He didn't succeed. So we're still back at 9, although there's nothing in the Constitution that forbids that from being changed. With regard to other courts, other than the Supreme Court, they are entirely creatures of Congress. Initially, when federal courts were created, they didn't even have jurisdiction to entertain claims under the Constitution or federal law. They were entirely claims when the plaintiff and defendant were of different states, called diversity jurisdiction. It wasn't until 1891 when Congress decided to confer federal question jurisdiction on the federal district courts. But from the outset, It was called the Judiciary Act of 1789. Congress decided to create lower federal courts, and they've been in existence since 1789. So they're almost part of the Constitution. But if we're just talking about authority, it's possible if Congress wanted to, they could just abolish all of the courts and just leave state courts with the U.S. Supreme Court at the top. There was something a little bit similar that happened under Thomas Jefferson and the lame duck session of John Adams' administration. He appointed what's so-called 16 midnight judges who were created in the lame duck session by the Federalists because they thought since they were going to lose control of the Congress and the White House, they wanted to control the judiciary. So that these judges were confirmed, but when Jefferson came in, they didn't impeach the judges. They just repealed the judgeship, said we really don't need them. They're superfluous. And that repeal was upheld in a case called Laird and Tatum in 1807, written by Chief Justice John Marshall. So the fact is that there's very little in the Constitution that protects the judiciary from being destroyed if Congress wants to destroy it. The American people basically said, with regard to Roosevelt in 1937, no, we like the courts as they are, but the sentiment may have changed in the ensuing 90 years.
Hannah?
Circling back to the public interest law event, if we set aside the question of how the administration is dismissing the program, motivating students to attend is a different thing. I'm curious, when you were a law student, what was it about any particular event that got you to go? What was a difference maker for you when you made those choices as a student?
I mean, if you want me to respond, I mean, the Harvard Law Forum had wonderful speakers at the time. You know, this was the height of, there was a lot of debate over the constitutionality of the Vietnam War. We had the Chicago 8, the attempt to prosecute those who had crossed state lines that were participating in the protests against the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Anyway, they had wonderful, wonderful speakers, and I didn't need to get any motivation. They were more interesting than understanding, the rule against perpetuities or trespass on case in medieval England. And I remember at that time, in the morning, I would get out of Hastings Hall, walk down to Harvard Square, and buy the New York Times and Washington Post, see what's in the newspaper. And that was an exciting time. This is a place that can be very, very intellectually vibrant, but you have to have an incentive to do that. Today, the students don't seem to have any of that energy, if you will, intellectual curiosity. And the Harvard Square doesn't have the newspapers anymore because everyone's on TikTok or social media. They don't even see newspapers on campus.
Speaking for myself, Hannah, I was at the law school in the apathetic 50s. And when Robert Hutchins, who was president of the University of Chicago, abandoned its star-studded football team, saying that's not a proper function of the university, he was a maverick, creative intellectual, came to speak at the Harvard Law School. The dean and the faculty, in effect, told us, you will be there in attendance. And Austin Hall was packed with students because the faculty and the dean said, you must go and hear Robert Hutchins, who then must have upset them because I remember that the one question he posed to us was, what is the purpose of the Harvard Law School? So we don't have that leadership anymore among the faculty in the deanship. And Bruce Fein and some other alumni, along with myself, wrote a letter to the director of admissions a few months ago saying, what's your criteria for admitting active applicants to go to Harvard Law School? If they show that they're activists, are you screening them out? And we gave examples of two students who were superbly qualified to be admitted and were denied admittance because they were very active. And the dean of admissions refused to answer the letter. And we've requested an answer for 3 times. So it's a more cowardly, timid type of law school whose explanations are still ready to be discovered. It's a real puzzle, isn't it, Bruce? Because they have tenure, they have status, they have wealth, and they have the ability to defend themselves because they're skilled lawyers.
You can say the same, Ralph, about the law firms, the big law firms, Paul Weiss, Skadden Arps, totally folding to Trump, offering $150 million worth of free pro bono services to advance any crazy cause that Trump identifies as a national emergency.
By the way, that you described as extortion.
Yeah, that's right. They extorted the free services so that Trump wouldn't go after them and they could get access to federal buildings. I mean, if that ever happened, you'd think that a law firm would want to use that as a badge of honor. If Trump then scorned you, whether you knew you must be doing something right then. And instead, it's not uniform. There have been some that stood up, but you'd figure that these law firms, they should be subject to discipline by the bar. They're casting the administrative of justice to be cast into disrepute. And the other thing that I raised this at the session, what about these government lawyers now who are making utterly deranged arguments, in favor of limitless executive power? Why aren't they subject to discipline too?
Yeah, and that can't be emphasized enough. In fact, they're offending Trump-appointed judges with their zany assertions, would flunk them out of law school in a month. And there are code of ethics that restrain lawyers from making deliberately frivolous arguments, as these Trump lawyers are doing now. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much. We've been talking with Bruce Fein, once again, a tremendous reservoir of intelligent constitutional retention and judgment. Thank you very much, Bruce.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Bruce Fein. We have a link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Okay, so now it's time to delve into the mailbag a little bit here and answer some listener questions. And Ralph, this one, I don't know if you know the particulars of this one, but I think the theme is something that you ran on when you were running for president. This question comes from Peter DeVoli from Scarborough, Maine. He says, what happened to Howard Dean's 50-state strategy that delivered the Congress to Obama? What happened to Howard Dean? Is this now ancient history?
I'm afraid it is, although the new head of the Democratic National Committee, Ken Martin, wants to have a party competing in all 50 states, as Dean proposed. Basically, his idea was rejected by the commercial consultants who raised the money and advised the Democratic candidates for Congress and the presidents. And their argument is, well, look at the polls. You don't want to throw good money after bad in losing races in Texas and Alabama and Mississippi. Let's concentrate on our base in the various other states, the blue states, and win the swing states. Well, as you know, that's a very, very risky thin ice tactic, because if you lose 3 swing states, you lose the presidency under our electoral college despotism. So Dean made some headway in the dialogues within the Democratic Party. He got some sweet talk from some of them, but eventually they rejected it, and he's no longer pursuing it.
Ralph, this next question comes from longtime listener Mark Abazide, and he says, I just listened to this interview Ralph did with Chris Hedges. Chris asked him about the campus protests against Israel's genocide in Gaza, and one comment Ralph made but didn't elaborate on was that the students shouldn't have focused so much on divestment, meaning divestment from Israel-linked companies and weapons manufacturers, because there's things they could have done to produce far more impact. Can you ask him to elaborate? What are those things, and how are they going to have a greater impact on ending complicity in genocide and empire than the work towards divestment?
By focusing on their members of Congress, summoning them to speak at the university, and if not, holding town meetings with empty chairs, because the real leverage over the Israelis starts with the Congress, which is in the pockets of AIPAC. And I think the students, because of their numbers, because of their zeal, because of their moral authority, should have put their attention on vulnerable members of Congress and not secretive corporate executives with indirect or direct investments in the operations that the students are objecting to. And in the process, they can demand hearings in Congress on the investments by their universities and other similar leverages that they envision having an effect. So it's a matter of where do you want to focus the leverage? And as you know from prior podcasts, I always start with the Congress.
This is from Levy. He writes, more must be done to fight Trump's relentless sabotage. There must be Republican senators willing to act to protect the government. Ralph, can you please share with your podcast listeners a list of those conservatives who you believe may be willing to abandon ignorant party loyalty to help derail Trump's agenda and restore checks and balances? We should all be making daily appeals to any of those we believe may still have a moral compass.
Well, you want to pick on the conservatives in the Congress who are up for election in 2026. those are the ones that tend to be a little bit more open to doubt and anger from the electorate. And also Tom Massey, Republican from rural area of Kentucky, is considering running for senator to take McConnell's place. He's a very independent legislator. He's willing to buck the party and has, as a minority of one, against the near unanimity of Speaker Johnson's loyal troops. He's won. Rand Paul on some of the issues. He's not his father, like Ron Paul was more bold, but he sometimes breaks ranks. So those are some of the conservatives that can be worked on, but focus on the ones that are up for election, especially ones in districts won by a Democratic presidential candidate. I have one question to the listeners. Listeners, if you want us to have an entire program on listener questions, if 1,000 of you email us saying yes, we'll do it.
All right. That's the challenge, listeners. So thank you for your questions. And I want to thank our guests again, Robert Weissman and Bruce Fein. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material, and we've got a fair amount of it. We call that the wrap-up, and it also features Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question in this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, listeners. Let's have 1,000 people tell us yes. We'll have a full day's program on your question, and we'll try to keep the answers short.
Yes, just email us at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
You ought to